Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Today, we're going to be taking a look at what we're actually going to have for our characters. Remember how we did a character worksheet with our main characters, the need sheet? Basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking our villains and we're actually going to be creating something similar. So, what I want to start off with is the idea of making sure that we are paying attention to the types of villains that we're creating. Generally, this is going to be somebody who has done a first draft already. So what we're going to take a look at is making sure that we have a system in place, a structure, as it were, to make sure that our villains are actually making sense to the reader specifically. Now, one of the first things I want to talk about is the idea of don't move the goalposts. What I mean by that is that sometimes when we have a single story that develops into a multi-story series, there tends to be a ratcheting up of the goals, of the stakes. We can kind of see this with the Marvel series. We had an antagonist in Thanos, but after Thanos was done, they had to find somebody else. So instead of having a universe that they were worried about, it was the multiverse. The problem is that when you start to make the villains bigger and bigger and bigger without having an end goal, it can definitely cause some problems when you're trying to create connection with the reader, or in the case of Marvel series, the watcher, and what's going on with the villain. We need to make sure that our readers and viewers can conceptualize the villainy that the character, the antagonist, we are putting on the page. Now, one of the things that we can do to help us get there is actually have an organization chart. This is kind of what I have for my own work in progress. This is a summary of the different people that are going to be part of the whole series. Like I said, this is for somebody who's already done their first draft, already has the idea of the story in their own head. So this is how I plan on conceptualizing the organizational chart of the big bad, or the series of people that the main character is going to have to overcome. Now, you could do this any way that you want. These are just some suggestions. What I would suggest specifically is not having everybody part of the organization, that you have different threats on the outside, things that are not connected. This will give a sense of complexity to your system. Now, not everybody that you have here is going to be a necessarily villain per se. So for here, the Count, somebody that we see pretty early on in the series, he's not necessarily a villain in the sense that he is looking to destroy the world or create chaos, but rather he's a selfish individual. He's acting more of an antagonist rather than a villain. Now, you could set this up with different color schemes, how you want to do it, and have different complexities when it comes to how things are playing out. Now, when it comes to actually showing how you want to have your villain, your personality, your villain, I would suggest using something like a stat chart. Now, what I would suggest, and I'll link this in the description, one of the things that you should do is you should make your villains beatable. If we take a look at the right side here, there's no way that any real character is going to be able to overcome this type of person. They're too powerful. They're going to overcome whatever they have. Now, if we give them a weakness, is what we're doing here. What we have here is there's a weakness, and this is agency. What I mean by agency is, and I'll go over the rest of them in a minute, but one of the things that we're talking about here is that he cannot act on his own, which means he requires somebody else to act for him, which is why networking is such a big deal. But the thing is if you make them too powerful, they're not going to be overcome easily and believably. That's where we want to make sure that we're paying attention to how our characters, particularly our villains, are shown. They're supposed to be pushing our main characters. The purpose of a villain is not to be evil, but to be the person that pushes the main character beyond what they are currently capable of being. Now, the reason I use these indicators is because it gives me the ability to have a well-rounded idea of what this person's actually like. So, for personal power, we're talking about, are they strong in themselves? Do they have the ability to defend themselves? Are they able to take out the enemy with ease, whether or not that is physical prowess, magical prowess, or any other type of power, personal power that comes from them? Agency. are they able to act in their own way? For instance, somebody who has a lot of agency, they don't need that many people around them to get stuff done. Somebody who has very low agency requires other people around him to do the things for them. Networking is kind of sister to that, because in order to have somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of agency, they need to have high levels of networking so that they are able to get what they need done. If you remove both their agency and networking, what essentially you have an animal that's tied to a stake. As long as you stay outside of its realm, outside of its sphere, it's helpless. Might as well be a puppy. We want to create danger for our main characters, and one of the ways is by having them be powerful in either they can do the work themselves or they have other people do the work for them. The next one is intelligence. Now, if you remember earlier in a video, intelligence is just not the accumulation of their knowledge, but rather how quickly they think on their feet, how quickly they are able to overcome the obstacles that your main character is putting in front of them. That's part of what's going on. You could always put in that they know about what's going on. They're well informed. That's where the idea of networking comes in, so that they're able to gather the information they need to make sure that they're supposed to overcome the main character. Now, resilience. Resilience is one of those things that can sometimes be interesting. Now, somebody who has a high level of resilience but a singular weakness, like Achilles' heel, these are ways that we can help make our main character overcome the main big bad guy believably. Now, for instance, one of the things you need to make sure is that you're not putting your main character in such a way that it's chance or luck that he overcomes, or he or she overcomes, the main bad guy. Not to say that other main bad guys or other bad guys that the main character is going to come across can't be taken out by chance or luck, but if your main bad guy, the person that you're building your main character up to face, is taken out by sheer luck, you're going to leave your readers disappointed, because they need an emotional catharsis. They need to know that everything that your main character has gone through up to this point has a reason to be done. And it's not just, well, he or she needed to overcome this for this reason, but this has nothing to do with them overcoming the big bad guy. No, there has to be a reason why you're going through this, and the emotional catharsis, the payoff, is when your main character beats the main bad guy. For whatever reason, everything is leading the main character up to this point. That's not to say that you can't have them overcome or fall back when they get defeated, as long as there is an element where the main character is using the skills and lessons learned earlier in the story to overcome the main bad guy. As long as they're being learned, it feels satisfying for the reader. Now, you can find this on the website. I'll link this in my description below. But one of the things is you can change out however you want to do it. Like I said, personal power is something where it's what they are doing themselves, like what they can act out themselves. You have a mage, he's going to have a high power. He's going to have a big ability to do what he needs to do. You don't want to have them, like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to have them powerful. If they're all powerful, you're not going to give your main character the ability to overcome them believably. And that's the key, believably. So, agency. How much are they able to do on their own? High agencies means they can blip around and do whatever they need to do without any sort of, holdups, without any roadblocks. This can be messed with. So with the idea, like for instance, certain superheroes that require stealth, they seem to have a higher level of agency than they actually do. If your villain's able to pop up unbeknownst to your main character and seems like they are everywhere, that's a high level of perceived agency. Now, they could have multiple people, say for instance, you have a villain, but it's not a singular villain, but multiple villains that have played a part in attacking the main character. While there's a perceived high level of intelligence, there's not actually a high level of agency. Now, what you could also do is you could have a shadow group, a group that as a whole has a high level of agency, but individually they don't. They can only be in one spot at one time. Networking. This comes down to how well they are able to get people to do what they want them to do. whether it's through leadership, whether it's through coercion, whether it's through violence. These are how your big bad person is able to get other people to do the dirty work. There's any number of ways this can happen, but this is a way that you can measure how potent your big bad is by how well they can stretch out their tendrils. Somebody who doesn't have a lot of personal power will rely on networking, other people to do the dirty work for them. Say you have somebody with a 4 level. They're going to be relying more on other people to do their dirty work. You have somebody who's wheelchair bound. They're not going to be able to do the physical attacking, and they'll have other people do the work for them. They'll have a big bad that stands behind them, a thug, a henchman, one of those characters who are able to actually attack the main character. Now, if you remove part of their ability to do the work themselves, you have to compensate that later. So somebody who doesn't have a lot of personal power, very little energy, resilience, we're going to give this person not going to have the ability to actually do a lot themselves. So they're going to be reliant on their intelligence and everybody else doing the work for them. So one of the things that you also want to make sure that you're paying attention to is that you have to give them something that the person's ability, the main villain's ability to do the work, or the secondary or the tertiary villain has a strength. And if it's a good villain, they're going to play on their strength and not necessarily on their weakness. So what the main character is going to want to do is to not just overcome what's going on with the main character, or it's not going to overcome what they're struggling with in your story, but rather also learning how to overcome the main character or overcome the bad guy that they're currently facing. Now, one of the ways that we can do this is this, like I had earlier with a note sheet about the needs of the main characters or the secondary characters. We can create an antagonist character sheet, but this one's going to be a little bit different. This is going to give us a little bit about how our character or how our villain's going to be focused, what their goals are going to be, how they mirror the protagonist. We're going to start with single. We're going to start off with their character status, like their marital status. Single. Do they have a partner in crime? If they get taken out, is there a second person that can come in and attack the main character? If somebody is married, by destroying the villain, are you setting up your main character to get attacked later? Their socioeconomic status. Do they have a lot of resources? Do they have a lot of money? What's their education level? Their parentage, showing how they came about, can be very pivotal about how the villain is going to be interacting with the world. What are their goals? To be pleasured. Somebody who's very narcissistic, somebody who's very self-centered is going to have very selfish goals, and they're going to do whatever they can to make sure they maintain that. Some to stay king. How they're going to do that is going to play a lot into how your story is played. How they mirror the protagonist. This is this type of person here, somebody who wants to be pleasured. This is what the main character looked like without self-restraint. The idea of self-restraint being something that our main character needs to learn, needs to understand that with great power comes great responsibility, or absolute power corrupts. Those are tenets that we need to make sure that our character is learning throughout this particular story, this particular arc. Now, this doesn't mean that the main character is going to be overcoming the big bad or going to be overcoming a lieutenant in the first book. This is, like I said earlier, this is for set up for once you have a draft. And I would suggest, and the way that I see it is, if you have a book that's going to be a series, making sure you understand what's going on throughout the series. I've read series where the main character just bops along without any sort of sense of where this is going. There's no resolution. There's no promises. There's nothing to say this is what the end's going to look like. They just continue the story just like an endless cycle. Granted, there are a lot of shows, because of the way the industry works, that they keep on adding more and build up and whatnot, but without a end result, you struggle to have a total emotional catharsis. So in TV series where they keep on adding, they have miniature emotional catharsis, where the cycle or the arc has its own emotional catharsis, and then you just follow the main characters into the next story, where essentially you're dealing with somebody who's overcome their issue, but now they're dealing with something else. The problem is with that, in my opinion, that a character's growth is going to be thin when you don't have an end result. You don't have an end point of where your character has to be. And because of how difficult it can be to create a continual growth in the character, which is one of the points of having a character arc, is to have that character grow. We want to make sure that we are paying attention to how the character is going to be interacting, not with just the world, not with just the allies and the situations that they're going to be in, but how they're going to be interacting with the villain. And villain is something that is designed to bring out the best in the main character by hardship, by suffering, by comparing the main character to the villain. The main character is going to be able to overcome those things which are lacking. It's a mirror to the protagonist. It's a way that the protagonist can see blind spots. Just like a ally can show the protagonist where the blind spots are, it's going to be a lot sharper. It's going to be a lot more painful for the protagonist to see their blind spots reflected by the antagonists. And then we have, how do we force the character to grow? How do we force the protagonist to grow? Willing to learn to suffer losses. What can end up happening sometimes is you have a character that's unwilling to allow things to happen. They're not allowing suffering to take place. In order to do something, sacrifices have to be made. That's a dangerous idea, because what happens when our main character becomes callous and suffering becomes something that they ignore, something that doesn't have a cost, it's so much easier to become evil. It's a balancing act that the main character has to learn. You cannot, the old phrase is, you cannot make an omelet without cracking a few eggs. You cannot do something without a cost being attributed. If there's no cost in our story, there's no stakes. Without stakes, it's boring, it's bland, it becomes disinteresting for our reader. We want to make sure that we're engaging our reader and having them feel a connection to our main character, and having the main character learn what it is to have acceptable losses is a very intriguing idea that we can put into our stories so that our character is connecting with our readers. Reasons for being defeated. Now, this defeated is not necessarily, we're not necessarily talking about somebody that has to be killed, but rather, in the example of Lord of the Rings, Sauron is not killed. He is defeated. What happens is, once the ring is destroyed, every ounce of power is removed from Sauron to the point where he cannot actually rise again. That is the point of throwing the ring into Mount Doom. So defeated does not necessarily mean killed, but rather removed from the situation, removed, having their presence, the danger of that person removed from the situation permanently. Typically that goes to death, but that's not always the case. For instance, the reasons why this character, Maximus, needs to be defeated. He will continue the cycle of attacking the kingdoms again and again and again, or his descendants will do that. Has his personal shortcomings impacted the main character, impacted other people? Are we taking a look at how this person is actually playing not just to the main character, but the world around him? What is the cost of removing him and then not doing anything with him? It's easy, and it's seen time and time again in medieval history, where you had a king who was dethroned, thrown into a tower, or thrown or locked up. Lords came in because they didn't like what the new king was doing. They rallied around the king that's in prison. It becomes a rallying point. Yes, there's always a fear that you have a messiah figure, killing him makes him a martyr. But a live king cannot become a martyr if killed. It's a threat. Now, there are reasons why they didn't do this. There's the reasons why kings, usurpers as it were, didn't kill the kings. But what happens is that if we're not careful, we don't give reasons for why we are defeating the main villain, or why we're not defeating any of the villains. It reduces the risk. It reduces the stakes of our story. All right, everybody, that's pretty much all I had. These are ways that you can build for yourself, ways of creating villains that have a lasting impact in our stories. This is not necessarily something that you're going to be putting out for other people, but rather this is something for yourself. So you can have a guidepost or a outline of what your villain's supposed to be looking like, not necessarily physical features, but what they're going to look like on the page. All right, as always, I will link all the information or all the resources I use in the description below. Any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comment section. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I